For decades, the absolute truth about what went down in the shadows of Cairo and Alexandria back in 1954 was buried. Buried deep under heavy military censorship and state-sponsored denial. Welcome to the Black Archive. Today, we're dissecting an intelligence failure so catastrophic, it didn't just cost the lives of the assets on the ground, it literally tipped the very first domino of a major international war.
Listen to this. Israeli agents planted bombs in American libraries and British theaters in Egypt, then waited for the explosions to blame it on Egyptians. Sounds exactly like a paranoid Cold War thriller, doesn't it? But this is historical fact. So, what happens when the bombs fail? What happens when a unit's commanding handler just vanishes into the night? The government back home starts forging paperwork to save their own careers, and the whole chaotic mess actually helped spark the 1956 Suez Crisis. Let's get into it.
Picture this. The year is 1954. The British are actively negotiating the withdrawal of their military forces from the Suez Canal. Now, for Israeli military intelligence, specifically Unit 131, this British withdrawal meant losing a crucial stabilizing buffer against a hostile Egyptian government. So, what's their solution? A textbook false flag operation. The strategy was to execute a string of sabotage attacks against British and American properties in Egypt, and then strategically blame all that violence on local Egyptian factions. The underlying logic here was cold, calculated, and ruthless. Make Egypt look incredibly unstable, so the British and Americans would decide it was just way too dangerous to pull their troops out of the region.
Now, looking at the actual mechanics of this sabotage, they were shockingly improvised. We're talking about targets like the United States Information Agency libraries, and the devices completely homemade. Operatives would take acid, place it inside a bag, hide that bag inside a hollowed-out book, and just casually leave it on a library shelf. The acid would slowly eat through the bag until it hit nitroglycerin, which triggered a delayed explosion. You have to understand, these were not designed for mass physical casualties. In fact, there were 0 civilian deaths. This was designed entirely for one thing: maximum psychological and diplomatic damage.
To actually carry out this sabotage without leaving any Israeli fingerprints, intelligence handlers recruited Sayanim. These were local Egyptian Jewish citizens weaponized specifically because of their dual loyalties. And you've got to notice the stark contrast here. On one side, you have young idealistic recruits who truly believed they were serving a higher noble cause. On the other side, their commander, Avri Elad. Elad was a cynical, hardened intelligence officer operating in Egypt under a truly chilling cover identity. He posed as a former Nazi SS officer named Paul Frank. This staggering disconnect between trusting local assets and a deceptive, mercenary handler, well, it set the stage for absolute betrayal.
When you dig into the personal letters and accounts from the time, it becomes incredibly clear that these were not hardened spies. They were civilians living perfectly normal lives before being shoved into a political meat grinder. Take Dr. Moshe Marzouk, for example. He was a brilliant 28-year-old Karaite Jewish doctor working right in Cairo with a long history of dedicating his medical practice to helping the poor. Or consider Marcel Nino, a young, idealistic clerk who literally just wrote about her simple desires for a quiet, ordinary life. They were everyday people weaponized by their handlers, completely unaware of the pitch-black darkness they were being led into.
When the collapse happened, it happened at lightning speed. Following bombings on July 2nd and July 14th, the entire network unraveled on July 23rd. An operative named Philip Nathanson was carrying one of these homemade devices, and it prematurely ignited right in his pocket outside a cinema. Arrests instantly swept across the network. But pay very close attention to August 5th. Avri Elad, the commanding field handler who ordered and orchestrated this entire chaotic mess, somehow managed to secure his own extraction. He vanished, leaving his civilian recruits completely exposed to the Egyptian secret police.
This right here is exactly where the clinical, boardroom strategy of a false flag crashes headfirst into brutal reality. You see, when an intelligence asset gets burned, the state usually just relies on plausible deniability, but for the asset left behind, it is a living, breathing nightmare. 11 people were swept up in the Egyptian roundup, and the physical and psychological pressure of those interrogations was so unforgiving, so immense, that 2 of the operatives, Yosef Carmen and Mayor Max Benneth, tragically took their own lives in custody rather than endure further torture or risk breaking under the interrogation.
For those who actually survived the interrogations, the December 1954 show trial delivered absolutely devastating sentences. Marcel Nino was handed a 15-year sentence, which, at the time, was the longest term ever served by a female political prisoner in Egypt. Others were thrown in prison for life. And for Dr. Moshe Marzouk and Shmuel Azar, the sentence was absolute. They were sent to the gallows and executed by hanging in early 1955. It was a permanent, tragic conclusion to what was supposed to be a deniable op.
Now, notice the massive narrative divide between Cairo and Tel Aviv at this exact moment. While operatives were facing the gallows, the official Israeli stance was an absolute masterclass in denial. The government publicly denied any involvement whatsoever, blaming the bombings entirely on internal Egyptian instability. Strict military censorship was slapped on the press to keep the domestic public utterly blind to the disaster. In fact, in the censored media, this catastrophic intelligence failure was vaguely, almost laughably, referred to simply as the unfortunate affair.
So behind closed doors back home, a second incredibly ruthless operation was underway, but this one was targeting domestic political rivals. When the Egypt operation blew up, nobody in the high command wanted to be left holding the bag. A bitter war of political survival erupted between Defense Minister Pinhas Lavon and Military Intelligence Chief Colonel Binyamin Ghibli. Lavon claimed he never, ever authorized the sleeper cell. Ghibli insisted he had direct, explicit orders from Lavon. This back and forth triggered half a decade of secret internal inquiries and ultimately culminated in Lavon being forced to resign in February 1955.
For years, Colonel Ghibli's faction pointed to an authorization letter dated July 19, 1954, as absolute, undeniable proof that the defense minister had ordered the bombings. But a 1960 internal review completely blew the lid off this entire cover-up. The letter was a proven forgery. Think about that for a second. High-ranking intelligence officials had literally fabricated state documents and committed perjury just to force a defense minister's resignation and cover their own tracks. It was a stunning exposure of bureaucratic rot at the absolute highest levels of command.
So how exactly does a botched bombing cell in Alexandria shift global power dynamics? By triggering a massive geopolitical chain reaction. The undeniable exposure of this Israeli false flag operation deeply eroded Western trust. It proved to Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser that he was facing real covert aggression, which ultimately pushed him away from the West and straight towards Soviet arms deals. This cascading breakdown in regional diplomacy directly set the stage for Nasser's monumental decision to nationalize the canal, which ignited the massive 1956 Suez Crisis, involving Britain, France, and Israel. A handful of poorly mixed acid bombs literally helped tip the first domino of a major international war.
It wasn't until 50 years later that the official silence was finally broken. On March 30th, 2005, the surviving operatives, the ones who had spent the very best years of their lives rotting in Egyptian prisons while their handlers walked completely free, were officially brought out of the shadows. They were awarded certificates of honor by the President of Israel. Half a century of strict, unyielding state denial was quietly reversed in a single afternoon ceremony.
But that belated recognition leaves us to process the immense human cost of all this geopolitical gamesmanship. And it brings us to a very cold, very uncomfortable question. If your government recruited your community to bomb allies and then completely denied it for decades while your people died in prison, would you still call them heroes?
The files on Operation Susannah are officially closed, but the archives are full of operations exactly like it. If you want to uncover more gritty, declassified realities of global intelligence failures, make sure you subscribe to the Black Archive channel. We bring the receipts, we expose the cover-ups, and we read the files the state never, ever wanted you to see. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next deep dive.